following podcast was written and produced before the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Upon reviewing its content and the various dialogues surrounding subsequent events, I have decided to leave it as is. In 2024, at least 64 countries will hold national elections. That's a record. The most in a year in the history of the world. Yet, somehow, democracy is under siege. I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is Later That Same Life. On each episode of my weekly podcast, a different topic, discussion, or story from our lives.
Season 13, Chapter 10.
Election Overload.
64 countries holding national elections in the same year. What are the odds? Astronomical. There's only 195 countries in the world. The fact that 1/3 of them have elections in the same year, it's worthy of note. Only about 167 countries claim to be some form of democracy. So really that number goes from 1/3 to about 40% of nations. That is about 2.5 billion eligible voters. The election results will affect about half of the world's population. All in 1 year, but let's break this down a bit. 2024 is elections for presidents, prime ministers, representatives of national assemblies, including the recent EU Parliament, which itself has a membership of 27 countries and elects 720 representatives. 2024 is one big planetary votorama, a votapalooza. This is why pundits, political scientists, among others, are watching closely to see which way the world is turning. What will the world look like at the end of 2024? Will 64 different snapshots form some sort of mosaic that will give us an entirely different big picture? Sucking up most of the oxygen is the upcoming U.S. election this fall. I guess so. It's the world's biggest democracy, world's largest economy. A lot is at stake. We've already seen major elections in England, France, Italy, South Africa, Mexico, India. India has 900 million registered voters. Their election took over 6 weeks to complete. Voters go to the polls in Jamaica, Fiji, Singapore, Indonesia, South Korea. Not to mention all those countries who put the mock in democracy, the illiberal democracies, where voting is a sham. Earlier this year, Vladimir Putin won by a landslide. Voters will go to the polls in Belarus, Syria, Afghanistan. And there was a recent snap presidential election in Iran after their president was killed in a helicopter crash. Do all of those votes matter? A little, mostly not. Some have speculated that Canadians might have an election before the end of the year. Doubtful. According to recent polls, Justin Trudeau would have no reason to call a snap election now. It'd be better to wait, govern with his tenuous NDP coalition, and hope for the best in 2025. Canada is one of the few countries in the world to use the term small L liberal. That's because one of our main political parties is called the Liberal Party. So if you're into the principles of liberalism, but not a fan of the party, you are a small L liberal. And as a result, Canadians were raised to believe that the opposite of liberal is conservative. It's not. The opposite of liberal is illiberal. That is a word you've probably been hearing a lot more recently. Liberals, small L, generally believe in individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, and free enterprise. So do many conservatives, at least the old school ones. Illiberals do not believe in individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, or free enterprise. Well, maybe a little bit that last one, but as long as it benefits them. In the last, approximately 2 decades, conservatives worldwide have become less conservative and more illiberal, to the point where we conflate the two. And rightly so, given the number of illiberal democracies in the world today. Hungary, Israel, Turkey. We say Turkey now. And perhaps soon the United States under a second Trump term. And it's that last one that at the same time seems unbelievable and inevitable. In 1952, Democrats and Republicans were so close that Dwight Eisenhower could have run for president under either party. He ran Republican. Americans then complained about a lack of choice. The two parties were so similar. Hey, you know those politicians, they're all alike. What changed? Well, Richard Nixon got elected. Not that politics wasn't a dirty game before Nixon. It's just that Tricky Dick and his gang of thieves took it to the next level. They broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try and get dirt on Ellsberg, who had embarrassed the administration with the release of the Pentagon Papers, a damning report on the handling of the Vietnam War. They challenged the media's right to publish information. They broke into Watergate. The future head of Fox News and the Fox Network, Roger Ailes, was then creating propaganda films and ads for Nixon. It launched a new era. It was our first sign of us versus them. Your political opponent was no longer just the opposition. They were the enemy. It was a congressman from Georgia, first elected in 1978, who promoted this principle, us versus them, and did so to the nth degree. Newt Gingrich, in my opinion, is the father of modern-day polarization in the U.S. My opponent is my enemy, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. History has been kind to George W. Bush, perhaps more so than he deserves, and kinder only by comparison to what the GOP has become today. But let's not forget, he was bumbling.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again."
And he was called out on it often by the left, leading to greater divisions. Then, a great portion of America, built literally on the backs of slaves and sentimentally on racism, resented the election of a black president. The Obama years. The whispers throughout white America was that we must never let this happen again. Shortly, candidate Trump gave them permission to say the quiet part out loud. He sanctioned the racist, misogynistic, and homophobic behavior of these hate-filled groups. Divide, divide, divide. The Trump mantra. 4 years of Joe Biden might have helped heal America if Trump had simply gone away. Except dictators don't just go away. All dictators all over the world throughout time have had common traits. They fall under what some psychologists call the dark triad. These three, they are narcissistic, they are psychopaths, and they are Machiavellian, which means they are cunning, scheming, and unscrupulous. Sound like anybody you know? Those under the dark triad seek power, and the ultimate power of president or a king. There are two, and only two ways to take control of a nation, electorally and militarily. This is why a record year of elections is being analyzed so closely, even in the most liberal democracies, where isolationists, autocrats, and others are trying to get elected. Then they'll try and be a dictator after that. And you might well say, well, just how can democracy fail in these times? Is it not entrenched in the world? The part we call the free world? Well, I guess, yeah, there's a free world that still exists. But there's Xi Jinping, who just last year anointed himself to a third term as president of Communist China. Putin won by a landslide. Yes, I am using the term for a natural disaster as a metaphor here. Modi in India is strongly suspected of illiberalism. So there alone, that's 3 billion people. And these nations have alliances with each other. And with North Korea, right-leaning Euro nations, certain South American powers, a newly isolationist Mexico, Well, before you know it, you're up to half of the world's population, either outright non-democracies or illiberal. So much for rocking in the free world. Mexico did have one of those elections this year. A bit of a sham and a setup. As we know, Mexico directly borders the United States. They are the largest trading partner to America. They have cheap labor, and they're near shore. Less chance of goods getting hung up in a supply chain disaster. And the U.S. currently has a lot of sanctions on China and Chinese goods. So China is coming to Mexico, and really what they want to do is use Mexico as some sort of clearinghouse for Chinese goods. They just want to buy the Made in Mexico label. And then those goods are only shipped a few hours by truck right into the U.S. It's an end-around run on the U.S. sanctions on China. Dictator dollars versus democratic dollars. It's all dollars. All this to say that people, whether they have a right to vote or not, are the market. Add up all the people and all the money. Soon democracy versus autocracy is relegated to some egghead debate status. Autocrats worked their way into power, and because of money and markets, we let them do it. They used wealth and the economy as enticements. They also stoked fear of immigrants. Immigrant and refugee numbers are greater than they've ever been in history. People trying to escape nations, largely due to unlivable conditions created by dictators back home. These poor people are stuck in the middle, running from autocrats, trying to get into countries in North America and Europe where Trumpians are calling them dangerous. You feel like a stranger in your own land. The immigrants are taking your jobs. Well, I will shut down the borders. And these are all signs that liberal democracy is under siege. Let me repeat, liberal, small l, a belief in individual rights, civil liberties, and free enterprise. Our democracy is threatened has actually become a political slogan. How bizarre. The biggest issue in a democratic election is, should we have a democracy? Oh yeah, and the winner of the Super Bowl will get to decide if we ever play football again. Liberal democracies have had a pretty good run. Around 300 years. Liberal democracy was the people's response to monarchs and the aristocracy of Europe in the 18th century. Your Highness, the people are revolting. Incidentally, conservatism was born out of the aristocratic echelon who were trying to hold on to their wealth and power. That's what the original conservatism was based on, while the people were out there calling for a more equally divided share for all. That is not a political statement. That is a fact of history. I mention this because some people do contend that after a good run of 300 years, maybe it's just a social change, a social evolution. Liberal democracies, you had your time, now let's try this. Of course, that's more like a de-evolution, isn't it? I've also heard this. Liberalism fails people because it leaves a hole in their heart. Remember the old saying, if you're not a liberal at 20, you have no heart. If you're still a liberal at 40, you have no brain. What is this hole in the heart? I think it is a failure of liberalism to properly educate. Individual rights, civil liberties, free enterprise. It's the promise of happiness. Sounds good. I'm in. Fast forward a few years, and many people still aren't happy. Must be the liberalism. Maybe I should switch over. The thing is, liberalism and its principles do not guarantee happiness. And as I said, liberals generally do a bad job of understanding that and passing it down. The principles of liberalism simply create the atmosphere for the pursuit of happiness. A lot of people do not make that distinction. So when some conservative comes along and says, hey, just follow me, follow my yellow brick road, we'll take you to the wizard, who will give you your hearts and your brains. And they'll also help some of the folks who just want to get home. You know, the Wizard of Oz was a parable of populism. Populism is defined in the beginning of the 20th century, the rights and freedoms of the people. In the 21st century, a populist is one that says that he and he alone can fix the nation, clean up the political system, drain the swamp, restore the rights of the common man. They often claim to be one of them, when really they are autocrats in search of power. It is said that dictatorships work, if I can use that term, work, in nations with many divided sects, and they're battling each other in complete chaos. There is no vote or democracy, only civil warfare, disagreements, arguments. Sometimes they say you just need one authority who, through force, says no more fighting, this is the way it's going to be. And for a while there's less fighting, the illusion of peace, and life seems to go on under a dictator. So some wannabe dictators feel it is to their benefit to actually promote division and civil unrest, because then it helps their contention that they are the ones to solve the problems and return the country to its once great self. In the early 90s, a 15-year-old named Giorgia Meloni joined a far-right neo-fascist organization considered so extreme that most in her nation of Italy barely gave them a second thought. Earlier this year, Giorgia Meloni was elected as Italy's prime minister. If we could go back to the liberals and conservatives of the 1950s, would that be any good? Probably not. And regardless of what Dr. Emmett Brown claims, we can't go back. So let's get back to our future. We have small L liberals who refuse to take ownership of the failures of their actions. We have conservatives who have draped themselves in nationalism, populism, isolationism, and even religion, and have become a worldwide illiberal movement. Ever heard of the IDU, the International Democratic Union? They were formed about 40 years ago. It's a right-wing think tank. At least I think it's a think tank. Headquartered in Munich, whose members include conservative political parties from dozens of nations, some parties in power, some in opposition. The current chair of the IDU is Stephen Harper, former Canadian Prime Minister, who fairly recently promoted his hand-picked Pinocchio, Pierre Poilievre, as party leader in Canada. Pierre speaks English, French, and the global conservative language of slogans, mottos, and catchphrases in lieu of actual substance. American Republicans are not the only conservatives to be choke-held by illiberals. It's going on all over the planet. And one of the chess masters is our own Stephen Harper. The worldwide push. It's why Hungary's PM, Viktor Orban, gets invited to and attends America's Conservative Political Action Conference. It's why Steve Bannon takes meetings in England. It's why Tucker Carlson goes to Russia. It is why true democracies fear foreign election interference. 64 elections, yes, but it's democracy under siege. Now, England recently booted their conservative government. France just rejected the far right. Poland recently ousted a right-wing government that was in power for almost 20 years. Brazil's liberals took back their nation only a couple of years ago. So there's pockets of hope. I've already mentioned the big democracies like India and Mexico that more and more now lean illiberal. The U.S. and Canada, in my opinion, hanging on by a thread. According to the Global Democracy Index, if you organize the world's countries by authoritarian, flawed regime, flawed democracy, and true democracy, the true democracies total 8%. That's 16 countries approximately out of 195. 64 elections, but by that data, what does that even mean? Autocrats want power. They've taken over the world's conservatives, who were already predisposed to monarchy and aristocracy. They are globally organized. Liberals don't know how to fight them. Generally, politicians have played the democratic system to their own good. They've politicized politics. I've mentioned this before. The true definition of politics is the interaction of people. We've made it a dirty word. We've been told our vote matters. So we vote, and nothing changes. So we stop voting. There's another problem right there. Voter turnout keeps getting lower and lower. News media covers politics like there's nothing else happening in the world. Leads to more fatigue, election overload. When I worked in management, we used to use a term called death by committee. Issues never get resolved because a committee cannot agree on a path forward. Too many cooks. Is that what democracies feel like these days? Death by committee? It's why a dictator starts to sound good after a while, especially if they claim to be a benevolent one. One guy to get it done. America, will it be the bellwether of our democratic future? Possibly. It's a large economy, but as I've pointed out over these last few minutes, it's only one country in a big, big world that seems to be going in a different direction. Plus, their choice, huh? An honest man who may no longer be capable, and a capable man who is a long-standing criminal.
There is concern about Joe Biden's cognitive abilities.
For a felon, for a criminal, from an adjudicated rapist.
Joe Biden, his very clear cognitive decline.
People, of course, expect Trump to lie.
Everything about the president's physical and mental abilities is now under a microscope.
Donald Trump is weak, he is incoherent, and he is a loser.
Even Biden's allies saying his mental fitness is fair game.
I know that he's been found guilty of the charges that were presented to the jury, but in some ways it feels like it's standing in for all of the other crimes this man has gotten away with his entire life.
You know, on that Global Democracy Index, the U.S. is listed under the category Flawed Democracy.
Later That Same Life is written, voiced, and produced by Larry Fedoruk. LarryFedoruk37@gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.